We are launching into an intensive examination of one of the most transformative and certainly one of the most terrifying events in modern consumer history.
Right.
We're talking about the Chicago Tylenol murders of 1982. This tragedy did far more than just claim innocent lives. It permanently fractured and then, rebuild the essential trust we place in the medications, foods, and products we buy right off the shelf.
It did. The methodical, chilling malice behind this crime fundamentally redefined safety in America.
It's hard to overstate the impact.
This was a crisis of monumental proportions, and it absolutely served as a crucible for new standards of consumer safety, really, globally. What we are exploring today is a series of seemingly random poisoning deaths across the Chicago metropolitan area.
And the victims were just regular people.
Exactly. They were simply retail consumers who ingested extra-strength Tylenol capsules that had been meticulously contaminated with lethal doses of potassium cyanide. Our analysis for you today is to trace the events, from the baffling initial discovery to the sprawling, frustrated manhunt that followed, and, critically, to explore the sweeping, enduring regulatory changes that emerged.
Changes that we still see every single day.
Absolutely. These changes established federal anti-tampering laws that affect how you, the consumer, open virtually every single packaged good today.
And before we get into the forensics and the corporate side of this, we really must confront the human cost. We are examining a calculated crime that targeted unassuming people using a simple over-the-counter pain reliever.
In that original poisoning wave, at least 7 people died.
And that was just the beginning.
That was quickly followed by subsequent horrifying copycat crimes across the nation. And the central agonizing fact of this case is that the perpetrator remains unknown and uncharged as of 2025.
Still unsolved. It's just incredible.
This case is pivotal precisely because of its immense lasting impact. Not only did it lead to the permanent end of powder-filled capsules for over-the-counter medicines, a delivery system that was, just deemed too easily compromised, but it also forced the creation of stringent, federally mandated anti-tampering laws.
These are the seals, the films.
Right. All the security features you now automatically look for every time you purchase a medication.
We want to pause and just express our deepest sympathies for the victims. Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, Stanley Janus, Teresa Janus, Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, and Mary Reiner, and of course their families, who lived through and continue to bear the weight of this unimaginable horror. The analysis of the source material that follows really does treat this tragedy with the seriousness and respect it demands. Okay, let's unpack the initial terrifying sequence of events that introduced this new era of fear. It all started so quietly, with the death of a 12-year-old girl, Mary Kellerman.
It did. The timeline begins on September 28, 1982. Mary Kellerman, she was suffering from a common cold, took a capsule of extra-strength Tylenol. She quickly collapsed and was hospitalized.
And she died later that same day.
Yes. And at the time, doctors were just baffled. It seemed like a sudden, severe illness, not a murder. She was the first victim in what would quickly become a catastrophic mass poisoning, though, of course, no one had connected the dots yet.
But the scale of the tragedy became brutally clear was one day later.
One day.
September 29th. That's when we see 6 other individuals consume contaminated Tylenol and die. And this is where the investigative alarm bells finally went off.
The source material draws a particularly devastating portrait of the Janus family. Adam Janus, who was 27, was the first to collapse.
His younger brother, Stanley, and Stanley's wife rushed to help him.
That's right. Stanley Janus, 25, and his wife, Teresa Janus, who was only 19, they rushed to Adam's aid at his home in Arlington Heights. Suffering from headaches and stress themselves, they also took Tylenol from the exact same bottle that Adam had used.
Oh, no.
They, too, collapsed and died within hours. It was a single, shared bottle that took 3 lives in one day.
That cluster alone is just horrific. But the source material reminds us that the poison was already circulating further than that.
It was. That same day, Mary McFarland, 31, died in Elmhurst. Paula Prince, a 35-year-old flight attendant, died in her Chicago apartment. And Mary Reiner, who was 27, died in Winfield.
6 deaths, all linked to the same common over-the-counter drug across different suburbs and parts of the city.
The sheer incomprehensible nature of this cluster death is what forced the investigative process to pivot. And here is where the specific details of the local investigation become so crucial. The critical connection was made not by the initial responding police or doctors, but by the remarkably astute action of a public health official.
We absolutely need to highlight the pivotal role played by this nurse, Helen Jensen, Arlington Heights' sole public health official, and investigator Nick Pichos. They were the key to halting the spread of this poison.
When Jensen was assigned to investigate the baffling deaths of the Janus family, she went directly to their household. She wasn't looking for standard evidence. She was looking for a health threat.
A different perspective.
Completely. She spotted the Tylenol bottle, confirmed by a receipt that it had been recently purchased, and crucially, she noticed that only 6 pills were missing from the bottle.
So 6 pills.
That number 6 perfectly correlated with the 3 deaths at the Janus home and the 3 other individuals who had been attempting to help them. She immediately suspected the Tylenol.
That is an astonishing level of deduction and focus. I mean, in the middle of a major crisis, she didn't just dismiss it as some kind of coincidence.
She acted on that suspicion immediately and turned the bottle over to investigator Nick Pichos.
And that suspicion traveled up the chain very quickly.
It did. Pichos contacted Edmund R. Donahue, the deputy chief medical examiner for Cook County, and Donahue had an immediate flash of insight, suspecting cyanide poisoning.
Why cyanide specifically?
Well, cyanide often presents symptoms that mimic a severe stroke or a heart attack, which was actually the initial diagnosis for several of the victims. To confirm his suspicion, Donahue asked Pichos to bring the bottle in and to smell it.
To smell it.
Yes. Pichos confirmed, noting a distinct, though faint, almond-like scent, which is a classic, though not always present, sign of cyanide.
Wow. Once that suspicion was verbalized, the confirmation was terrifyingly swift.
It was. Chief toxicologist Michael Schaefer's team tested the remaining capsules. And the findings were not just positive for cyanide, but they were overwhelming. 4 of the 44 remaining capsules in that Janus bottle contained massive quantities, nearly 3 times the lethal amount of potassium cyanide.
3 times the lethal dose in one capsule.
The public health implication here is just paramount. That immediate toxicology confirmation led to an immediate, unprecedented action. Authorities held a press conference advising the entire public in the Chicago area to immediately stop taking Tylenol.
That must have caused chaos.
It was the first time an over-the-counter medication had been centrally identified as a mass threat.
So the next step was tracing the specific product. This is where the detective work became a race against time, primarily through the product lot numbers.
Right. The initial focus was narrow because the bottle Mary Kellerman used had been inventoried by paramedics. So investigators quickly noticed that her bottle and the one used by the Janus family came from the same specific production lot, MC2880.
Okay, so at this point, they're thinking it's a manufacturing issue.
Exactly. The initial working theory was that the contamination had occurred at the manufacturing level, maybe a single isolated failure related to that one lot number. So Johnson & Johnson initially issued a recall for all Tylenol associated with lot MC2880.
But it wasn't that simple.
Not at all. The situation escalated rapidly and horrifyingly. Investigators discovered tainted bottles from other lots, specifically lots 1910MD and MB2738, which were associated with pills found in Mary McFarland's possession and other locations.
What does that finding tainted pills from 3 different lots tell us about the nature of the crime?
It's the key piece of evidence. It's what ruled out factory contamination. It proved beyond a doubt that the tampering was not confined to one batch or one manufacturing location, which meant the threat was far broader and much more localized.
A saboteur.
It signaled that this was a retail-level saboteur, deliberately introducing the poison into individual bottles across different stores and different lots.
And that finding immediately and exponentially expanded the scope of the crisis. But let's look at the sheer geographic spread of these tainted pills. They weren't centralized at all.
That's right. The tampered product was found on shelves at multiple types of retailers across the region. Jewel Foods, Osco Drug, Walgreens, Domix, and Frank's Finer Foods. This spread suggested the perpetrator was operating locally, moving frequently, and targeting general retail environments rather than one specific chain or location.
So a systematic effort.
It demonstrated a systematic, if localized, effort to poison multiple bottles and return them to the shelves.
And there is that chilling detail about the 8th contaminated bottle that was found, but thankfully not used.
Yes. A woman purchased it, but the sources say she sensed something was off. She simply did not use it. She was saved by a flicker of intuition.
That just highlights how close this crime came to being even more catastrophic.
It underscores the sheer randomness of the threat. The victims were selected entirely by chance based on what bottle they happened to pick up from the shelf.
That brings us to our next segment, Understanding the precise scope of this tampering and analyzing Johnson & Johnson's reaction, which, despite the horror, became one of the most famous case studies in corporate crisis management.
Let's start with the mechanism of the crime, because it really dictated the public response. As we established, the police hypothesis and the physical evidence pointed overwhelmingly to the tampering occurring at the retail level.
Or maybe a distribution center.
Possibly, but certainly after the product left the secured factory environment.
And the evidence ruling out factory contamination is robust. You mentioned that the tainted capsules were traced back to products manufactured at two completely different sites, one in Pennsylvania and one in Texas.
Precisely. If the contamination had been a manufacturing error, it would have been restricted to the product line of a single factory.
So that's the proof.
The fact that poison pills were sourced from two distinct production points confirms the method. Someone removed bottles from local store shelves, opened the tamper-resistant seals that were standard at the time, introduced the deadly potassium cyanide into select capsules, and then placed the packages back onto the shelves for unsuspecting consumers to buy.
And it speaks to the terrifying simplicity of the act. The seals at the time, they were just simple glued paper seals inside the cap. They were easy to breach and replace without immediate, obvious signs.
And that reality is what forced Johnson & Johnson's hand. This was a company that suddenly found its flagship product, which held 35% of the market share, transformed overnight into an instrument of death.
Their immediate response is now taught globally as the gold standard of corporate public relations.
It is, and it's largely credited to the vision of Executive Harold Burson.
Let's talk about those immediate actions because they were radical. They didn't equivocate at all.
Their first step was immediate and total. They halted all Tylenol production and advertising, a massive and costly decision. They also distributed extensive warnings directly to hospitals, medical practitioners, and distributors, bypassing the slower general media channels at first.
But the defining move came on October 5, 1982, the nationwide recall.
A nationwide recall, yes, even though the tampered product had only been found in the Chicago area.
That decision right there demonstrates a true prioritization of safety over profit.
It was an extraordinary undertaking. They pulled an estimated 31 million bottles of Tylenol off the market. To put that in perspective, the retail value of that stock in 1982 was over $100 million.
Which today is?
Today, that translates to roughly $326 million. This was a staggering financial hit, one that very few companies would voluntarily absorb without definitive proof the entire national stock was compromised.
And their public engagement went even further than the physical recall.
It did. They didn't just wait for the news to report it. They took out national advertisements, pleading with individuals not to consume any of their acetaminophen products until they could sort through the crisis.
Even though it was later found only the capsules were affected.
Right. They also offered to exchange every single Tylenol capsule purchased by the public for solid tablets, which were deemed impossible to tamper with in the same way.
And that decision to offer a free exchange of all capsules nationwide, that must have been crucial in rebuilding trust.
It absolutely was. It communicated that J&J was willing to sacrifice immediate revenue to ensure their customers felt safe. They also established formal, transparent working relations with the Chicago Police Department, the FBI, and the FDA, making sure they were active partners in the investigation.
It's interesting that the Washington Post published a piece praising J&J for how they handled the disaster, saying they were honest with the public. They contrasted it sharply with the perceived lack of transparency in incidents like 3 Mile Island just a few years earlier.
And that honesty and swift, aggressive action are precisely why the brand survived. The sources indicate that at the time of the scare, J&J's market share for over-the-counter analgesics plummeted from 35% down to a terrifying 8%.
8%. But because of their proactive response, they executed one of the great commercial comebacks in history.
They did. They rebounded in less than a year.
How exactly did they manage that rapid turnaround?
They executed a three-pronged strategy that has become a textbook case. First, the public perception was strong. They cared more about lives than money. Second, they focused entirely on product innovation.
The new packaging.
Exactly. By November 1982, they reintroduced Tylenol, but crucially, it was housed in a new, revolutionary triple-sealed package. This included a glued box, a plastic seal around the neck of the bottle, and an inner foil seal. This was the birth of true tamper-resistant packaging.
And the third prong, that was the caplet.
Yes. They leaned heavily into the caplet, that smooth, easy-to-swallow tablet shaped like a capsule, and permanently moved away from the powder-filled capsules that facilitated the crime. They coupled the safety innovations with heavy price promotions and public education campaigns, emphasizing the new security measures.
And within a few years, they were back on top.
Fully regained the highest market share in the U.S. It just demonstrated that consumers value transparent honesty and proven safety measures.
So while the swift actions saved the brand's reputation, the financial fallout was staggering, leading immediately to questions about corporate risk, specifically who was going to pay for that $100 million recall.
This is where we get into the complex world of corporate liability insurance. McNeil Laboratories, the J&J subsidiary that manufactured Tylenol, submitted a claim to its insurance company, Affiliated FM Insurance, specifically for the cost of the recall itself.
And that claim was denied.
It was.
Wait, why would an insurance company deny a claim for a voluntary but obviously necessary recall?
Well, the court proceedings revealed a crucial distinction in risk management. The court determined that McNeil Laboratories was ultimately not covered because Johnson & Johnson had chosen not to purchase the more expensive, specialized recall insurance policy.
They had general liability insurance, but that wasn't enough.
Right. That policy was written primarily to cover costs related to negligence or direct liability for injury.
So because the contamination was an act of criminal sabotage, not a failure in their own manufacturing process, the general liability policy didn't automatically kick in.
Precisely. McNeil sued again, arguing that their existing excess liability insurance should cover the expenses. But the court rejected the claim, articulating that the recall was not caused by liability for the 7 deaths. It was at best merely related to the 7 deaths.
That is a critical legal distinction for anyone, preparing for a corporate meeting.
It is. The court was saying they ruled that the company wasn't liable for the deaths, so the massive cost incurred was a voluntary mitigation effort, not a cost necessitated by a legal finding of liability.
So J&J absorbed the cost because it was the ethical decision, but legally, the insurance company was off the hook.
It was a very hard lesson on the limits of standard insurance policies in the face of mass criminal tampering. Despite all that, J&J did seek closure with the affected families. In 1991, they settled all lawsuits against them for an undisclosed sum.
What was their reasoning?
A company spokesman stated that while they could not have anticipated the criminal tampering, they wanted to do something for the families and finally get this tragic event behind us.
Moving into our third major segment, the investigation into this heinous crime became a massive interagency effort. However, decades later, the killer remains elusive, leaving behind this complex web of circumstantial evidence and 2 primary, frustratingly inconclusive suspects.
The initial investigative efforts were desperate. They were trying to find any weakness in the perpetrator's resolve or psychology. One of the most unique strategies came from FBI criminal analyst John Douglas, a pioneer in behavioral profiling.
Right. What was Douglas's theory about luring the killer out?
Douglas theorized that the perpetrator might possess a narcissistic need to revisit the scene or acknowledge the impact of their crime, especially the death of the first and youngest victim, Mary Kellerman.
So he suggested publishing her address and grave location.
He did. And this was done with the consent of the Kellerman family, which speaks volumes about the lengths people were willing to go to achieve justice.
It does. Did it work?
The Chicago Tribune columnist Bob Greene published the story in early 1983. Both the Kellerman home and the gravesite were placed under 24-hour video and physical surveillance for several months. It was an extremely resource-intensive operation.
And nothing.
Unfortunately, the strategy failed. The killer never surfaced or was not detected.
Another key focus was the attempt to identify the killer through visual evidence. Police released a surveillance photo of the victim, Paula Prince, purchasing the contaminated Tylenol at a Walgreens.
Yes, and the photo clearly showed a bearded man standing just a few feet behind Prince at the cash register. The police strongly suggested that this individual could be the killer. They released the photo hoping the public could identify him.
But he was never found.
Despite numerous leads, this individual was never definitively identified or linked to the crime.
And all of this investigative effort quickly converged on one man, James William Lewis, who became the primary and longest-running suspect, even though he was never charged with the murders themselves.
Lewis, who also used the alias Robert Richardson, inserted himself directly into the investigation through a highly calculated act: extortion. He was accused of sending a detailed letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million in exchange for a promise to stop the cyanide-induced murders.
That immediately placed him under intense scrutiny. What did the investigators find out about Lewis when he was arrested?
When he was arrested in New York City, Lewis denied responsibility for the murders, but he readily admitted to writing the extortion letter. What made him extremely suspicious was that he gave authorities a detailed, unsolicited account of exactly how the tampering could have been carried out.
He knew the method.
He described buying Tylenol, introducing cyanide, and returning the bottles to the store shelves. He seemed to possess an insider's knowledge of the modus operandi. Furthermore, investigators found evidence of his specific interest in poisons, and his fingerprints were found on pages related to cyanide in a confidential law enforcement document about the case.
But during his trial, his attorneys argued that the letter was just a bizarre attempt to focus attention on a former employer of his wife.
Right. But he was ultimately convicted of extortion and sentenced 10 years in federal prison.
But the circumstantial evidence only grew stronger years later when forensic science caught up.
It did. In 2007, authorities re-examined the extortion letter. They determined that Lewis's letter was postmarked October 1st, 1982. This seemingly small detail created a massive investigative breakthrough.
Why is that specific date so crucial?
Because if Lewis began writing the letter on September 28th, as he claimed, he would have started writing it prior to the very first news reports concerning the poisonings, which only began on September 29th and 30th.
He would have possessed knowledge of the crime before it was public knowledge.
Exactly. This completely undermined his claim that he was just trying to divert attention to his wife's former employer using a sensational crime he read about in the newspaper. When confronted with this timeline discrepancy, Lewis famously recanted his original claim.
So for decades, that timeline discrepancy was the single strongest piece of circumstantial evidence linking him directly to the crime itself.
Absolutely. And the legal assessment backed this up. Court documents released in early 2009 show that Department of Justice investigators officially concluded Lewis was responsible for the poisonings, despite the fact they still lacked the smoking gun evidence to charge him with murder.
It's fascinating how far the investigation pushed into the 21st century. What happened when modern forensic testing was applied?
The investigation gained fresh momentum in 2009. In January 2010, Lewis and his wife were asked to submit DNA samples and fingerprints. Lewis publicly maintained his innocence, claiming, "If the FBI plays it fair, I have nothing to worry about."
But the DNA didn't match.
When the DNA recovered from the contaminated Tylenol bottles was analyzed, it did not match Lewis's DNA sample. This created an immediate, agonizing conflict.
The behavioral and timeline evidence pointed to him, but the forensic evidence did not.
And he maintained his denial until his death.
He did, until he died in July 2023.
That DNA exclusion forces us to look at the second major suspect the sources detail. Roger Arnold, a dock worker who had proximity to the locations where the tampered bottles were placed.
Roger Arnold presented a different profile of suspicion, more volatile and circumstantially linked. He was a dock worker at a Jewel Osco store in Melrose Park, one of the locations where tainted pills were found. More damningly, the authorities discovered that he possessed potassium cyanide.
And there were alarming behavioral issues reported by people who knew him, correct? Yes. Marty Sinclair, a bar owner whose establishment Arnold frequented, reported Arnold's erratic behavior and stated that Arnold had discussed killing people with a white powder. Arnold had become increasingly unstable after his marriage dissolved, and police started tracking him very closely.
There are also specific circumstantial links to the victims that are incredibly unsettling.
Indeed. Arnold had worked with victim Mary Reiner's father at a warehouse, and Arnold's wife had been treated at a hospital across the street from the store where Reiner bought her cyanide-laced Tylenol. These links suggested proximity and perhaps motive, although a clear, direct motive for targeting these specific individuals was never established.
And the evidence found in his home also pointed to an interest in poisons.
Authorities found a copy of The Poor Man's James Bond in his residence. This book, widely known for its illicit instructions, contains specific information on how to manufacture potassium cyanide. Arnold was held and questioned several times by police, but like Lewis, he was never formally charged with the poisonings.
And the sources detail a tragic, separate incident involving Arnold in 1983.
Yes, Arnold's volatile behavior led to the death of an entirely innocent person. In the summer of 1983, Arnold was seeking revenge on the bar owner, Marty Sinclair, who had reported him to the police.
And he made a mistake.
A terrible one. Arnold mistakenly identified a computer consultant named John Stanisha as Sinclair and shot and killed him outside a bar. Stanisha was an innocent bystander caught in Arnold's rage.
Arnold was convicted of Stanisha's murder in 1984. He served 15 years and died in 2008. But the Tylenol connection didn't die with him.
No. The authorities' commitment to solving this case, even across decades, is remarkable. In 2010, Arnold's body was exhumed so that his femur could be removed for advanced DNA testing.
And again, no match.
Just as with Lewis, Arnold's DNA did not match the samples discovered on the contaminated bottles.
So we have two prime suspects, both with strong circumstantial evidence, motive, and proximity to the crime, yet both were excluded by modern DNA analysis.
It underscores the intense difficulty of solving a case where the tampering occurred at the retail shelf level, where DNA contamination could be widespread. And that difficulty led the FBI to cast an extremely wide net, even looking at criminals who are already imprisoned for other similar behavioral patterns.
Specifically, the investigation turned to Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, in 2011. Why Kaczynski, given that he specialized in explosives, not poisoning?
The connection was primarily geographical and temporal. Kaczynski's pattern of bombings began in Chicago and its suburbs in the late 1970s, and he maintained ties to a suburban Chicago home in Lombard, Illinois, which he visited occasionally around the time of the 1982 murders.
So the FBI requested DNA samples from Kaczynski to rule him in or out?
They did. Kaczynski denied ever having possessed potassium cyanide. The request was more about due diligence, exploring any possible link between a known domestic terrorist operating in the same area during the same time frame.
Nothing came of it.
Ultimately, no public evidence ever definitively linked Kaczynski to the Tylenol murders. The case remains officially unsolved, a testament to the chilling anonymity and complexity of retail product sabotage.
We now shift to our final part, which details the profound aftermath of this tragedy and its enormous, long-lasting regulatory legacy. This is really the systemic, positive outcome that emerged from a horrific act of criminal malice.
The 1982 incident triggered monumental, immediate changes across the entire pharmaceutical industry and quickly extended to food and general consumer products. The most visible, immediate change was the rapid obsolescence of the powder-filled capsule.
It seems so obvious in hindsight that capsules were unsafe. Why did the industry stick with them for so long? Was it simply cost, or was there a consumer preference?
It was primarily efficiency and cost. Capsules are easy to produce, are perceived as easier to swallow than hard tablets, and until 1982, the industry operated under the assumption that the simple cap seal was sufficient.
The Tylenol murder shattered that assumption.
Completely. It made the fatal vulnerability of the capsule delivery system impossible to ignore. A foreign substance could be placed inside with almost no visible signs of disturbance on the exterior packaging.
And the FDA acted swiftly on that.
Within a year, they introduced much more stringent regulations aimed at avoiding any possibility of product tampering. This led directly to the widespread adoption of the solid caplet, which is essentially a tablet made in the shape of a capsule, as the preferred, non-tamperable drug delivery form.
The caplet became the new industry standard.
It did, replacing capsules for nearly every major over-the-counter pain reliever.
But the regulatory legacy goes far beyond the pill shape. The crisis directly inspired the development and mandatory implementation of tamper-resistant packaging across virtually all consumer product industries.
We're talking about the technology that is now utterly ubiquitous. Induction seals, that foil seal you peel off the top of a medicine bottle, plastic safety rings around the cap that break when opened, and improved blister packs for smaller medications.
So this move established mandatory, verifiable tamper-evidence security as the new global safety standard.
It did. And perhaps most significantly for law enforcement, product tampering was officially recognized and made a federal crime.
That's a crucial development.
It is. Title 18, Section 1365 was established, creating the federal offense of product tampering. This meant that subsequent acts of malicious product sabotage could be prosecuted aggressively across state lines under the full weight of federal law, rather than being treated solely as local state murder or assault cases.
It provided a unified, powerful legal tool. And we immediately saw that federal law put to the test through a tragic yet ultimately successful use in subsequent copycat fatalities.
The sources detail hundreds of copycat incidents involving various products immediately following the Chicago deaths, showing the level of public fear and malice that the original crime unleashed.
And the most famous subsequent case that utilized the new federal law was the Excedrin tragedy in Washington state in 1986.
Right. Two people, Susan Snow and Bruce Nickel, died from cyanide-laced Excedrin capsules. This case shows how the new federal law was designed to function.
What made the Excedrin investigation different, and how did it lead to an arrest?
Well, the investigation quickly pivoted from looking for a random saboteur to focusing on the domestic environment. Investigators discovered that the contamination was highly localized. The ultimate breakthrough led to the arrest and conviction of Bruce Nichols' wife, Stella Nichol.
She had intentionally poisoned her husband and Susan Snow, likely to collect on life insurance money.
Correct. Stella Nichol was a chilling example of the new federal law in action. She was sentenced to 90 years in prison under the new federal anti-tampering laws. It demonstrated the immediate teeth the new legislation had.
There were other significant incidents, too, reinforcing the continued threat of localized tampering, even after J&J implemented triple seals.
Yes. In 1986, Diane Ellsroth, who was 23, died in Yonkers, New York, after ingesting cyanide-laced extra-strength Tylenol capsules. This led to the finding of a second tainted bottle, proving that even with new packaging, sophisticated local criminal acts were still possible.
Just much harder to execute undetected. The anxiety at the time was so high that even hoaxes had massive commercial consequences.
They did. That same year, Procter & Gamble's pain reliever Incaprin was recalled after a spiking hoax was reported in Chicago and Detroit. Even though the report turned out to be false, the resulting collapse in sales was so precipitous that the company withdrew the pain reliever from the market entirely.
Wow.
The Tylenol crisis had fundamentally changed the commercial risk tolerance for products involved in even alleged tampering incidents.
And we also need to look at the Sudafed case in Washington state in 1991, which again showed the calculated use of these new anti-tampering laws.
In that case, Kathleen Danaker and Stanley McWhorter were killed by cyanide-tainted Sudafed. A third victim, Jennifer Melling, was poisoned and went into a coma but thankfully recovered. The investigation found that Jennifer's husband, Joseph Melling, was responsible for the tampering.
And his motive was financial as well.
Correct. Melling was convicted of their deaths and the attempted murder of his wife. He received a life sentence. These subsequent cases, particularly Nichol and Melling, demonstrated that the new federal law was effective at prosecuting domestic product tampering, where the crime was covered up to look like the work of an anonymous, random saboteur.
Let's briefly touch on the Anison case in Texas in 1986. This one highlights the complexity that arose when every sudden poisoning death was immediately linked to the possibility of Tylenol-style sabotage.
Right. A University of Texas student, Kenneth Ferries, died from cyanide poisoning traced back to tampered Anison capsules. His death was initially ruled a homicide. But due to the immense scrutiny applied to all poisoning cases, the investigation continued aggressively. A later report ultimately ruled it a likely suicide, with the FDA determining Ferries had obtained the poison from a lab where he worked.
So the crucial point here is the incredible depth of forensic scrutiny, that every single poisoning death was subjected to following the Tylenol crisis.
Exactly. The baseline assumption had shifted from accidental death to possible tampering.
And beyond pharmaceuticals and the legal system, the Tylenol incident created an immediate, profound cultural impact, amplified by the fact that the entire crisis unfolded in October 1982, right before Halloween.
The timing was just disastrous for public anxiety. The incident raised massive renewed fears across the country, reviving that urban myth of poison candy being given to trick-or-treaters, a myth that had previously been almost entirely undocumented in terms of actual deaths.
And this fear was so widespread that some communities and parents actively discouraged trick-or-treating for Halloween in 1982.
They did. They kept their children home as a safety precaution. The psychological damage to consumer trust was undeniable, and the market reaction proved it. American grocery stores reported that candy sales were down more than 20% that year.
The Tylenol murders taught the public that common, everyday objects, even candy, could be weaponized by a random stranger.
An idea that profoundly shaped consumer behavior for years.
As we bring this analysis to a close, the essential insights gained from the source material are deeply sobering. An act of focused local malice against 7 victims fundamentally fractured the social contract of consumer trust, forcing a global industry to completely redesign how it packages and delivers products.
It forced pharmaceuticals, food processing, and general retail sectors to prioritize public safety over convenience and cost, leading to mandatory packaging reforms that are now standard operating procedure worldwide.
So while the initial victims were innocent casualties and the perpetrator remains agonizingly unknown,
the knowledge gained from managing this crisis and the subsequent permanent regulatory changes are a permanent part of our legal and commercial landscape.
what's fascinating here is that the legacy of the Tylenol murders is the visible, triple-sealed packaging you handle every day. It's a permanent physical reminder of a moment when the public learned how vulnerable everyday consumption could be.
And the commitment that followed to ensure that level of vulnerability never returns. It is a dark case, but it demonstrates a profound truth about governance and industry. that critical systemic change often requires a catastrophic failure in existing safety protocols.
So this crisis forced a swift adoption of measures like federal anti-tampering laws and secure packaging that now protect millions.
Even though true justice for Mary Kellerman, Adam Janus, Stanley Janus, Teresa Janus, Mary McFarland, Paula Prince, and Mary Reiner remains elusive.
Thanks for listening.